Breaking news this morning, as we know, retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra O'Connor has passed away at the age of 93. All of this coming here into our studios here on Live Now from Fox. Joining me now is Dr. Mark Caleb Smith. He's the director for the Center of Political Sciences at Cedarville University in Ohio. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining me here on Live Now from Fox at a moment's notice. I know it's a lot going on and shocking news to the world. What can you tell us at this hour?
Yeah, it is shocking in some ways. I mean, because anytime we hear of a former justice passing away, it's going to be a significant news event. But in other ways, it's not that shocking. I mean, she's retired from public life 5 years or so ago, I believe, because of dementia that was settling in. And so in some ways, it isn't all that unexpected.
Some people unfamiliar with her work, we know here in the media and you as well, being a director of political sciences. But for those that are unfamiliar with her work, what can you tell us about her work in the political realm, in the Supreme Court realm, and how she impacted society?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that while she was on the Supreme Court, Sandra O'Connor was the most powerful woman in the United States of America. She was one of those sort of moderate justices that was on the court. Therefore, she would kind of go back and forth sometimes between the more conservative wing and the more progressive wing of the court, which meant she had an awful lot of power, just sort of as one of those in-between votes. And so between Justice O'Connor and Justice Kennedy, they really were that middle block on the court for quite some time. I think culturally speaking, probably her most influential act on the court was to uphold Roe versus Wade and the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision. There's a lot of argument at that point, a lot of thought that maybe this relatively conservative court would strike down Roe versus Wade. But Justice O'Connor, along with Justice Souter and Justice Kennedy, filed an opinion where they upheld the basics of Roe. And that's it was a significant cultural moment when that took place. She was also very influential in other areas of the law as well. You know, whether we talk about federalism, whether we talk about affirmative action, she was an incredibly influential member of the court. And of course, being the first woman on the court, also culturally influential as well.
We actually heard a statement earlier from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a statement that was released to us where she said that she was encouraged by now the late Sandra O'Connor to just do it. And when you think about the late woman and how she kind of pioneered women in the political system and encouraged them to get into those spaces where sometimes they were otherwise not accepted, how do you respond to that?
Now, I think there's a lot of truth to it. Justice O'Connor, when she graduated from law school, was near the top of her class. But given when she graduated, she was really only offered secretarial positions at law firms, not positions as a lawyer. And so when she started into the legal profession, it was difficult for her to even find a job as a lawyer, much less think about being a member of the United States Supreme Court. And when President Reagan ran for office, he pledged to appoint the first woman to the court. He stayed true to that pledge and chose to elevate her to that position. Obviously, a very difficult position for her in many ways. You know, the eyes of the world were truly upon her as the only one on the bench for most of her tenure. And she was remarkably influential, not only for women who are a little bit more like her, maybe Republican, a little bit more conservative, but also women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who came from a different orientation. And so, yeah, I think a remarkable woman because of the trailblazing that she did as a woman on the court.
You raised a great point there, Dr. Smith, that even crossing party lines, there were several people that still agreed with her and what she stood for. When you think about the political system today, do you think people could learn from her as far as the coming together aspect when it comes to, you know, putting laws and different things into place that affect all Americans?
Yeah, it's a tremendous question. Justice O'Connor was a politician before she became a judge. And so she was a member of the elected body in Arizona. And she had a reputation even then for being someone who would work across the aisle. She would host dinners at her home for Democrats and Republicans and try to figure out ways that they could get together and maybe reach some compromise on some issues. So I think you see that mentality when she gets onto the court. She was always willing to be one of those swing votes, as I said, and go back and forth a little bit between the two sides. Yeah, I think when you look at our polarized politics right now, and when you look at the United States Congress, for example, when you look throughout many of the states as well, that polarization is there, and it's getting much more severe, I think. And Justice O'Connor could be a good model for maybe how we overcome that. There are lots of political risks for being sort of that moderate in between person. But I think she's an excellent role model for that. And I know from what we know of her life after being on the court, she lamented that change in the political system as she was off the court. She just saw it become much more rigid, much more ideological, and I know that it grieved her quite a bit.
I was going to say, we do know she did retire from the Supreme Court, but did you happen to know a shift in the Supreme Court once she retired as far as how things were handled?
Yeah, I mean, think of it just very practically speaking. The justice that replaced her was Samuel Alito. Justice Alito, conservative, much more conservative, I think, than Justice O'Connor. Certainly part of the right wing of the court, if you want to think of it in those terms. And the court today, depending on how we count numbers and how we look at the issues, it's a 6-3 court with a pretty conservative majority. Justice O'Connor never occupied a court like that at all. And so the politics have changed quite a bit from when she was on the court. The appointment process has changed quite a bit from when she was on the court. You know, when she was going up and when Justice Scalia and even Justice Ginsburg were being confirmed decades ago now, they were getting 90, 98, sometimes even unanimous support from the United States Senate. Now that just is very unlikely to happen. And so it's become a very partisan process, not only to get on the court, but even once on the court now, it seems to be a bit more polarized than we would like.
You know, when you would hear the late Sandra Day O'Connor speak, she didn't like to be looked at as the woman on the Supreme Court. She wanted to be looked at as someone who fought for the people on the Supreme Court. And even though we know she was the first woman to serve on that role, can you talk to the fact of her male counterparts and how they surrounded her during that time? Was there support for her as she worked to propel and work for those goals that she had while she did serve?
So we don't know a ton about how things actually happen on the court. I mean, those things are generally behind the scenes. They don't talk a lot about personal relationships. We don't really get a good glimpse into how the court conducts its business necessarily. We do know that Justice O'Connor had a law school classmate on the court with her, and that was Chief Justice Rehnquist. And so you know that there's a relationship there. From everything that I do know of that era of the court, there was a lot of collegiality, lots of goodwill, lots of fellowship across different disagreements on the court. And so I think she was certainly part of that process. I think when you look at how she decided cases, you know, she tended to be very practical, very pragmatic, and that won her a lot of support amongst different elements of the court, but also different elements of our political system. So I think, you know, I think she had an unusual influence, not only on the court, but potentially on the history of our country.
Dr. Smith, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you. As we do wrap up our commentary with one another, are there any final words or any final moments as we do reflect now on the late Sandra Day O'Connor when it comes to how she carried herself in the Supreme Court and outside of the Supreme Court, and also how you would like for her to be remembered being a member of the political realm?
Yeah. I think for just a moment, let's talk about her life after being on the court. She retired. You know, some members of the court really serve until almost the point of death. Sometimes they do die while they're still on the court. She retired and had a good bit of time off the court to decide what she wanted to do with herself. She devoted herself to her grandchildren, true, but she also developed an organization that would begin to really promote civic education in the United States. Sandra Day O'Connor cared very deeply about her country, and she wanted to make sure that future generations of students would also care deeply about the country, respect its institutions, respect the Constitution, and really to become good, productive citizens in our society. And I hope that legacy keeps moving forward. I think if we could use anything in our country at the moment, it's a little bit of a higher standard for citizenship and a little bit more care for the history and traditions that we have.
I love how you mentioned that education aspect, because we do know that College of Law at Arizona State is actually named after her. So just going to your point that she was a pillar in the education community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that with some other justices as well, but it certainly does speak to her influence, not only across the country, but particularly in her home state of Arizona.
All right, Dr. Smith, thank you so much again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I know it was at a moment's notice, but we appreciate you joining us and sharing about the life and legacy of the late Chief Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who's now dead at the age of 93. Thank you so much for joining us.
You.